Okay. So the topic that was advertised, and which we'll go ahead with, is mindfulness of thinking, actually. And I don't know, maybe you had a few thoughts in the last hour, I'm not sure. Thinking generally gets a bad rap in Buddhist circles. You know, it's kind of justified in some sense, because if we've practiced more than about 5 minutes, we know that thinking is a cause of a lot of problems in our mind. But really, we only have problems with thinking when we're kind of identified with it and getting wrapped up in it, which we all do, you know, at various times. But I think this is exactly why it's very important to study thinking, right? So it's an area that brings suffering for many of us, and we're taught to turn toward suffering. Suffering is to be understood. So what is going on? I'll pause for the planes. Yeah, so what is going on with the thinking mind? So first of all, though, thought is not evil. It's not something bad that happens during your meditation, and when you have thoughts, that means you're not doing it right, or that the ideal meditation is one where there aren't any thoughts. People can suffer under that one for a long time. But actually, thoughts are what the mind does. Minds think. That's kind of like what they excrete. There's nowhere to flush it away in the same way, but it doesn't at all help to believe that we're going to sit down and stop thinking. And it only, as we may have learned from practice, it only makes it worse to be upset about our thoughts and to try to get them to go away. So I'm hoping to offer some other ways to relate to thoughts and to learn from them and to use them on the path of practice, because they do actually have a use also. Suzuki Roshi captured it well when he said, "Don't be bothered by your thoughts." It's a very simple instruction, but not easy to follow necessarily. But it's great advice. Certainly, one way of practicing is to learn to let thoughts go, to kind of let them drift by like clouds. It's great freedom to be able to do that. And so if that's possible for your mind at this moment, great. But it's also fine training to study thoughts. So also from Zen, to study the self is to forget the self, and to forget the self is to be enlightened by the 10,000 things. So much of our thoughts are about ourself, and so much of thinking is something we identify with. This is really worth looking at. But it is important to study thoughts and thinking in the correct way, because they're really hard to study carefully and correctly. It's real easy to sort of go off track. So I'm wanting to lay out in this talk some of the helpful ways to study thought and thinking so that it is actually Dharma practice and it leads toward wisdom and liberation. Because we live with our thoughts all day, and mostly we don't have a relationship with them that is about developing wisdom. Mostly it's all about following them or believing them or identifying with them or wishing they weren't there. But there is actually a mode of relating to thoughts that is helpful and progresses the path. But in light of that, we'll start with what isn't so relevant about working with mindfulness of thinking. The first is the form of the thought. So when we first look, we'll notice that thoughts come in a variety of forms. Some of us think in words, blah, 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 all day there's that speaker going in our heads. And some of us think more in images. Somewhere there's a movie screen and it's going all day and we're glued to the screen like we get to be in the airport. And then, probably each person has a dominant type of thought, and different ones come in different ways. I know for me it's kind of a mixture of thoughts and images. So puzzling over this, like, what type of thinker am I, is probably not relevant, just as a start. And then a little bit more closer to home, the content of the thought is actually less important than we usually think it is. So the content of thought, you may have noticed, is very often about me, about, or maybe for you it's about you. It's probably not about me, right? So, you know, that's fine. We do have to kind of direct our body through the world if we're thinking in that way. But it doesn't have a lot to do with developing wisdom and compassion, is getting wrapped up in the content. If you do want to pay attention to content, there are actually some instructions. I was amazed. The Buddha does give some things that we can notice about the content of thought, and particularly he says to notice kind of what the domain of thinking is, and there's 3 different domains defined. At the grossest level, we think about other people, the opinions we have about them, and ourselves in relation to them. That's the gross level of thought. At the slightly more subtle level, there are thoughts about your ethics and your reputation and about your home country. I'm just reporting what the sutta says. And then at the subtlest level, there are thoughts about the Dharma. So we think about, oh, can I apply metta in this situation? Or, you know, this is like the 4th foundation of mindfulness. Am I seeing, what hindrance is present right now? Or how can I use this on the path? Like which of the 4 noble truths is being pointed to here? So that's actually a fairly subtle level of thought. I don't mean to imply that these are like, you have to be on retreat to have the 3rd level. And they can come actually at any level of consciousness. But they're considered, it's more refined to be thinking about the Dharma than to be thinking about your opinions of other people, for example. And so it's nice just to kind of check in and see, like, what level is my thought at? That's actually useful. And then you can say, could I think more about the Dharma in this situation? Could I refine it a little bit? I like, though, that this implies that in the end, even thoughts about the Dharma are going to be abandoned. But you don't have to abandon them too early. Just don't be distracted by the content. So if those are areas that aren't as useful to really get wrapped up in, the form and the content of the thought, you know, what are wholesome approaches to working with thought? There are generally 2 of them. One is to abandon thought through the development of concentration. This is kind of on the cushion. And then the second is studying the process of thinking through practicing mindfulness and investigation of thinking. And that can be done in many different ways. I'm going to touch on the first one briefly, but then we'll get to the second. So abandoning thought through settling the mind, basically. This is what is normally taught in the standard set of instructions, right? So it's the right thing to do at the beginning of a sit and also at the beginning of practice. If you've only practiced for like a week, mindfulness of thinking is pretty hard, actually. But it becomes at some point really, really relevant and really necessary to advance the path that we need to move into actually looking at the processes of the mind. So abandoning thought through concentration truly just means not indulging in thought. So anytime there's something that is not the meditation object happening, whether the object is the breath, the body, metta, something else, anything that is not that, we let it go. And you might have to let it go 50 times, but that doesn't mean your mind isn't too concentrated. You're still always turning back towards the object. The failure of concentration practice is when you get on the train and go for a while, which we all do. But if your mind is continually falling off and then you quickly bring it back, it's kind of the quickness of bringing it back, actually. Although that's somewhat awkward language, your mind doesn't go anywhere. But it allows different things to come into it. It allows different things to arise or to be the object of attention. And so concentration practice, where we abandon discursive thinking, is that every time the mind tries to go off on a train, we just don't do it. And it's resettling, allowing that object to be the main focus of attention. This is actually great practice. It's a lot of fun. I was told by Tanisaro Bhikkhu, who lives close to here, right, out at Metta Forest Monastery, he said one time to me, get really good at zapping thoughts. And it's true, actually, that when you're doing this kind of meditation, if you see a thought start to arise, sometimes when you look right at it, it's like, where'd it go, you know? You think, okay, I'm going to see that. Oh, it's not there. So there can also be times when we're sitting fairly well settled, and there's maybe only subtle thought or just a little bit kind of vague, we're not paying attention. And there can be this feeling in the mind like a bubble rising toward the surface. You know, it's like into the stillness, we feel a thought starting to form, and then it's possible to just not go with it and feel it relax back into the background stillness. Now, you don't know, that thought might have been the solution to world peace. Or it might have been the great American novel that you've always been trying to write. But if you think about all the thoughts you've had, what are the chances really? So it's probably okay that you'll never know what that thought is. But it's interesting, right? Wow, I'm never going to know what that was going to be. Cool. So, and then there are actually other methods mentioned in the suttas about how to not fall into thought. There's a whole sutta called The Removal of Distracting Thoughts, which is a read in and of itself. But these are all about the idea that, okay, we don't want to get caught up in the thinking, and anytime it happens, we're just going to let it go. And it's a great practice because by not putting energy into it, you temporarily reduce the strength of that thinking. And so you can sit in meditation calmly, you know, and then we get up and we have to think, and that's okay. But it's a really great practice to work on abandoning thought through concentration. But what I want to go into more deeply today, mostly because it's not talked about quite as much, is the second wholesome approach to working with thoughts, which is to investigate the process of thinking. Do you understand how thoughts arise, how they form and have their life, and how they pass away? It's possible to be mindful of that whole process. Now, if you're mindful and the thought goes away, well, you missed that one, or we don't get to study that one. But with a little bit of subtlety, it's possible to let thinking go for a little while and still be mindful of it. And that is really interesting, and that's important to learn. So basically, we watch thought occur. This leads to insight into conditionality. What conditions are present when thoughts are there? How do they form? How do they go away? And also the ways that we identify with thought. Because inevitably you watch for a while and then it's like, oh, that's a good one. And then you realize, oops, I lost it. But I saw it for 2 seconds before I did that. And so you've learned a little bit. So as we start to engage with the process of thinking, we begin by kind of getting the lay of the land. So we notice that there are various functions or modes of thought. Not the same as the form, words or images, but there are functions, like there's commentary, there's explanation, there's view formation, there are desirous thoughts, there are long monologues about why we're right about something, you know. So these are worth looking at, kind of like field research. It's like, oh, what do I usually do if my thought is running? Because there are different kind of focuses that the mind likes to think about, different tracks that it runs on, right? And so it's nice to be familiar with those, kind of like cataloging. But that's just preliminary, you know, that's just so that you are going to be able to recognize it easier when it starts. And so then the essence is really to observe the process of thinking, the arise, the change, and the passing away. And this is actually part of the fourth aggregate. So there are these 5 aggregates that are said to be what make up a person, and they include form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. I won't go into all of them, but just so you know, thought goes into mental formations. It's like what the mind constructs, basically, out of experience. So we're told in the Satipatthana Sutta, in the section on observing the Dhammas, that we are to observe the arising and passing of the aggregates. So we should observe the arising and passing of thought. It's right there in our fundamental training. So you're justified. You don't have to think thought is bad. It's actually told to us that we should observe this. But what we should observe about it is its arising, its change, and its passing, not what it's telling us about ourselves or the world or etc. So then we start to get, if we do this for a while, we see thoughts arise and pass. We start to get at an intuitive level that they're very impermanent, actually. Thoughts feel very solid when we're identified with them. That thought, my presentation tomorrow, solid. But really, the thought about it, it has no weight, it has no shape, it has no color. I might feel like it has some of those things, but really it's very, very ephemeral object in the mind. And hence, pretty unsatisfactory to cling to. We cling to thoughts all the time, of course. We have a lot of ideas that we believe, and sometimes when thoughts are happening, we cling to them. But they're not very reliable. They're actually one of the most insubstantial things in the universe, unless we make them something else. And then we can look further. What are the causes and conditions that support thought? And how is thinking unfolding? How can it be, how is it to let go of a thought such that no identity forms? So starting to get these feelings, and I'm going to give some techniques for how to do that in a moment. So this is really the realm of Dharma investigation, and it can lead to liberating insight. Thoughts can be the gateway through which we really learn something very fundamental about, impermanence, suffering, and not self, the fundamental three characteristics that are the gateways for liberation. Thought can be one of those. It's not a horrible, terrible thing if you look at it correctly. So how do we, what is this practice? How do we actually observe thoughts as they run? I found it takes a light touch it's a real balance, right? In order that the thoughts don't just vanish by looking at them, but that we don't get sucked into their orbit, right? So it's kind of like surfing or something, you've got to have just the right touch there. It also takes strong mindfulness. Actually, mindfulness of thinking is something that's good to do after you've settled a bit in meditation, maybe settled in your body. It's easier after you've practiced for a while. So the best metaphor I've found for how to actually do this is to see thoughts as energetic phenomena in the mind, and to actually feel them as forms of energy. Just, I don't want to say disturbances, because that has a negative sound to it, but events or changes in the feel of the mind. I see people nodding, so I know, not falling asleep, not nodding. So I hope this language is somewhat helping. But the mind, when we settle back into it, can be seen as kind of a matrix of energy, and things are happening in it. Sometimes they're very solid, and sometimes they're not. Kind of like what I encouraged with the sound of the music is, can we just be transparent and let that vibration flow through? Sometimes we can. And in the same way, a thought can be seen as something that's just passing through if we're not looking at the content of it. It's a little vibration, essentially. And so then, once we start seeing things that way, then we see these patterns in the mind, and they have different feelings to them. It's kind of like, this one feels magnetic. I want to fall into that one. Or this one feels, a little bit tense, like there's it's pulling some stress along with it in the mind, or some tension. And then we can also start to see the mind as kind of a space or a medium out of which thoughts form, right? And so there's this moment where there's nothing, and then we see something kind of pulling itself up out of the medium, like a water monster pulling itself up out of the water. And it's actually quite an amazing process to see this come out. It's almost like an art object, like a sculpture, or maybe like clay forming into a sculpture on a wheel, right? And it can actually be, if you see it just this way, it can actually be kind of beautiful. And we realize, oh, I am creating. This is why they're called mental formations, things that we construct or create. I am creating this amazing thing. I had the experience one time of sitting while I was thinking about a view that I had about something. Oh, I really think it's like this, and this is why it's like this, and this is why I'm justified in thinking that it's like this. And then I said, wait, I want to watch the process of this. And so I kind of allowed myself to detach from the particularities of the view and to watch the aesthetics of that forming. And it was kind of like making a sculpture. And then I would put like little embellishments on. Oh, and in fact, this is related to neuroscience. Look, I can put a little bell over there, And I had created this whole thing. And then there was sort of a sense of admiring it. And this is what we do, right? So I'm describing it as an energetic phenomena, but this is the equivalent of when we sit there and we think through something and we say, I think what we need to do, I'm going to the strategy meeting at work tomorrow, and here's what I think we really ought to do. It's, we need to have more Dharma talks at Insight San Diego. We need to find a way to bring more people, and then there comes this this is why it's important, and this is how I'm going to bring it about, and this is how I'm going to counter what that other person says, and so forth. I shouldn't have given that example. But this is the same process, and we kind of enjoy it, right? It's kind of fun to go through and think about why I think this and how I'm going to do all that. And then when I saw the almost aesthetic nature of the energetic phenomenon in the mind, I realized that's the appeal. That's what draws the mind in. We like beauty, and we make these beautiful mental constructions. Now, sometimes we make mental constructions that are pure suffering for us. We explain why we're going to fail at what we're doing, or why our life is about to become horrible because of something that's about to happen, or why it is terrible with something. And it's less obvious why we do that, but it's more habitual, I think. This is a familiar way of thinking. At least I understand this one. At least it has a familiar feeling about it. It's interesting, right? There is actually a teacher who teaches people to observe thought after they've been lost in it. And his method of teaching is that you sit down and you let your mind do whatever, which usually involves at least getting lost in thought a few times. And then afterwards, you see if you can remember. You wake up from the thinking and you say, okay, let's see, what was I thinking about? And you can actually track backwards and kind of write down the process that you went through in thinking. We have enough of a short-term memory that we can construct that process if we turn toward it directly. And this, too, is a way of learning about the formation, the construction, the change of thought, and then eventually they're passing away. It's called recollective awareness, is that practice. So we begin to notice that thoughts have a feeling tone. That's basically what I was describing with the ones that are beautiful or the ones that are terrible. They're pleasant or they're unpleasant. They have a feeling tone to them. And surprisingly, we can grab onto either. I don't know why we grab onto the unpleasant ones, but we do. They're familiar. But there's a lot of wisdom in knowing that thoughts come out of nothing and go back into nothing. A lot of wisdom there. We still need to think. I'm not saying that because thought is impermanent, it's completely irrelevant. That would be like saying because the body is impermanent, don't take care of it, why bother? Of course. So thought, too, is something that's useful, that we need in our life. But we see that it's that it's ephemeral. It's not worth identifying with in the same way as we might have before seeing that. So we start to see through, the lens of seeing the three characteristics of things changing all the time, things not being satisfactory homes to grab onto, and not really being necessarily ours, in a sense. I'll tell a story. A friend of mine, his partner had some kind of a medical condition where she had artificially induced menopause. They did something with her hormones for that. And so she was feeling a little different because of that. She was premenopausal, but had been put into menopause by these drugs. And she, one morning at the breakfast table, she said, "These are not my thoughts." And she had just noticed that the usual stuff that ran through her head was different than it had been. That was a big insight. It's like, oh, so the other stuff, I mean, it was still her in the sense, but it was the version of her that was on that medication, on those drugs. Wow, what have we got running through our mind all the time? So, maybe they're never our thoughts, I'm not sure. We are definitely responsible for what arises in our mind and, either acting on it or not, basically. But it's not our fault. They're not ours necessarily. Our response is up to us, but they're not necessarily from us. I was contemplating the other day, have I ever had an original thought? Well, first of all, how would I know? But I'm not sure. The conditions that create thoughts come from everything I've heard and seen and taken in, and so much of that is passed around between people and seen on the computer and the phone. I don't know. Maybe I've had a few, but it's interesting to think about. So essentially, there's kind of two ways to go about relating to thinking. One is we're totally lost. We're fascinated by it. We get swept up in it. And I know that's part of our life. But then there's also handling thought skillfully, relating to it as a phenomenon in the mind, something that we have a choice about, something that's interesting to observe arising and passing. For example, the sound is not that present right now. Did anybody notice that end? So, things arise and pass, thoughts arise and pass. Very interesting. It takes some skill in mindfulness. So this is a way that if you've been doing mindfulness for a while, it might add to your repertoire to start investigating thoughts and thinking, discursive thought compared to momentary thought, all these different things. Or especially if you suffer a lot from thinking, this can be a really vital practice for reducing the suffering, really reducing the suffering by adding a little bit of wisdom to it. I think if we understand the process of conceiving, which is the process of producing concepts, producing thoughts, if we understand that fully, the mind is going to let go out of wisdom because it'll see that's not really worth it. We'll be able to have the thoughts and use them as we need to navigate, but not buy into them as much. This is a poem that may point toward that. Reject existence and you fall into it. Pursue emptiness and you move away from it. With many words and thoughts, you miss what is right before you. Cutting off words and thought, nothing remains unpenetrated. Yeah, so you're actually talking about two different things. One is there's the thought itself, and then there's the aversion to it, right? And so the thought itself might actually be one that brings suffering also, that's painful in and of itself, but then the aversion adds to that if you start saying, oh my God, I don't want this. So one approach to kind of start disentangling that is to look at the feeling tone and just feel, wow, this is unpleasant. The thought is unpleasant, my reaction to it is unpleasant, and just be with that. That's actually the point where the mind gets sucked in or not, is that it's something unpleasant. It will eventually end. There are conditions for it. But sometimes, if it's especially strong, just being with the unpleasantness takes enough of the sting out of it that the thought can then be handled in some other way. You can either turn your mind away without aversion. You can just decide out of wisdom, I don't want to pursue this. And then the reason that turning away, quote unquote, seems to feed it is because you turn away with rejection. If you actually turn away with wisdom, this is not a useful thought for me to have right now, it won't have that effect. It won't have that residue to it. So I would recommend looking at feeling tone. things that are especially unpleasant, you can actually put an antidote on, like such as metta or compassion. Probably not, if it's an aversive thought about a person, don't try to do metta for that person at that moment. It's usually can be difficult, but for yourself, wow, I really suffer in relation to this person. It's really hard to be thinking this way, to be feeling this way. It's hard to be in this situation. And try to bring up some tenderness for yourself in that area. Do either of those resonate, or are you, am I missing the mark?
I'm sure some of it would be helpful to, I don't have, it's not about another person. I do have some thoughts that I have a lot of them.
Well, a couple things come to mind. One is to offer one more technique, just in case, and that is to contemplate the disadvantages of having that thought. So you can say, wow, I really suffer because of this. I don't think I want to be thinking in that way out of wisdom and compassion for myself. So that's one of the other ones that's mentioned in the teachings. But also a story comes to mind when you started talking about trying different things and them not, and this particular one being impervious. There's a story of, it's a Milarepa, I believe, he's been meditating in a cave for a while, and then he goes out somewhere and he comes back and discovers that a bunch of demons have occupied his beautiful meditation cave while he was gone. And so at first he's angry and he says, don't you respect the Dharma, go away. And like a couple of them go, one or two. But then the other ones are still there looking at him. And so then he tries love and he says, oh, it's so nice to see you. Let me offer you some tea. I would really love to be your friend. And a couple of them kind of shrink and dissolve because he's showing kindness to them. But there's still one, big and nasty, and he doesn't care about the tea. And so Milarepa realizes, okay, that's not working on this one. So he finally just goes over and he opens the jaws and he puts himself in the mouth of the demon and he just gives up and the demon dissolves. So different techniques are needed for different things. It's good to have a repertoire. Yeah. Yes. And then.
Could you talk a little bit about the interface between thoughts and thinking about?
Yeah, so that's like a little bit farther along in the process, because when we're sitting on the cushion, we observe the thought arising and changing and then eventually passing because we're just sitting on the cushion. We're not acting on it, right? So this is an interesting realm. The link between thought and action has something to do with intention and with aspiration. If it's a longer term thing, like becoming a teacher, you need to hold that in mind and do a series of actions based on that thought. I find it a little bit mysterious, actually, the link between thought and action. So I'm glad you're asking about it, but I can also see why you're asking about it, because some thoughts and some intentions are somehow strong enough to actually produce action, and other ones are not. And that's interesting, right? To give kind of a odd example, on retreat, I was once asked to observe intention, sort of the moment before I act. And it's true that even every simple action does have an intention before it. You can see that if you're watching. But I got to a door, and for some reason my mind was feeling very settled. And I saw the intention arise to reach out to the doorknob, but it didn't happen. And then I saw the intention arise again, and it didn't happen. But I was so settled, I didn't care. I was just watching this. And then eventually, I reached out and opened the door. What was different about that? I don't know. Something else had changed in the conditions. But just the thought of, I'm going to reach out and open the door, somehow wasn't strong enough to produce that action in my body at that moment. And I think this is just a miniature of what plays out in our lives, right? How many intentions and aspirations have we had that didn't happen? It's like somehow we didn't get it together and the conditions didn't do that. So this is an area where I think actually meditation helps us clarify. I mean, I love that you're wanting to share your wisdom. And what I found is that over time, so I have done a little bit of work on this area of making things happen, if you will, because I was really bad at it for a long time. And there's kind of a cycle of connecting with your values and your intention and your motivation and being clear of what you're doing, so you want to share your wisdom. And then there's the, like, how do I do that? And so there's kind of a period of trying a lot of different things, like maybe you apply to several different programs, or you apply to several different jobs, or you start going out to lunch with people that you think know about this. You just kind of do this broadcast of stuff. And then certain ones are going to start to go, like there's going to be channels that start to open. Oh, this person invited me to come and observe them in the classroom. I think I'll do that. I'll say yes to that. So say yes to everything. And then you'll notice that some things just kind of stop, even though you thought they were a great idea. But other things kind of go, and like it leads to the next thing. And so you follow those channels. But it's not just linear, because once that starts to move, it's important to go back and revisit your values and your intentions to make sure that you're not getting sucked into something that no longer matches those exactly. Does that make some sense? Well, it makes sense to other people. I don't know if I'm addressing your question, but I think it's a fascinating process and somewhat mysterious, but very dharmic. You know, the way things unfold is certainly out of our hands, and yet we influence it. And this is exactly this, you know, this interchange. Yeah. I saw this one. You had your hand up earlier, and then I saw yours.
I had a question about being a physics background, not outside.
What's the value of the left brain? Yeah.
Were you a particle physicist?
No, I was a condensed matter physicist, material science. This is a great question because the left brain, the question was about, he's asking about my physics background, having an engineering background himself, and he basically asked how that analytical thinking has served in the path of practice. Because left brain thinking is another thing that gets a bad rap in Buddhist circles. But you have to remember that in a lot of Buddhist traditions, analytical thought is very much a part of the path of practice. We don't do as much of it in the Vipassana tradition, but like some Tibetan traditions, you have to be an expert debater, and you have to go through a lot of academic type education before you can be a teacher. And even actually in some of the Theravadan countries, they do a rigorous thing of more educational. I think there's a place for analytical thought and a limit to it also. And what I found in my own, I can't speak in general, but I can say that in my own path of practice, I had to actually not use my left brain as much as I would during a significant part of my practice. I had to just say, you know what, I'm not gonna, like I didn't do academic Buddhist studies. I read the suttas, but I read them as practice instruction and kind of as poetry and as for the heart. And I knew that if I did, like if I took a Buddhist studies class at the university, it would be a distraction in a certain way, because I'm too good at that in a sense. There are people who need to do that, actually. They could use a little rigor. But for me, I knew I needed to soften that a little bit because I was unbalanced, essentially. And then after a certain period in my practice, I found that I wanted to do more of that. I did take an academic Buddhist studies course. I wrote the papers. And I started, reading more scholarly things and kind of engaging that part and saying, I want to think about this. I want to compare Vipassana to Dzogchen. I want to really kind of understand these linkages and learn about the history. I started learning Buddhist history, which I totally ignored for a while. It's like, I want to know how that all unfolded and how it ended up turning into the Theravadan tradition out of the original 24 schools that there were. The Theravadins won, basically, and that's what got passed on, but there was a lot that got left behind. So what I'm saying is that in the end, you have to include everything. You have to include the whole brain. The left-right balance is really important. And there are specific times when if you're feeling like the left brain is not so useful to me right now, that's fine. You can let it go. Or there can be times when you get too caught up in the right brain. You're too sucked into the faith, the devotion, the emotion, and a little wisdom is helpful. So balance. But maybe it's balance over time. Yeah. Does that help? Yeah. Okay. And then I saw one here. We're right at time, but let's go ahead.
Oh, well, you may have just answered my question. It's a speculative question, but I was hoping that you would speculate with me. I think both things can be true.
I like this in that, to add a speculation, it may be that in the more Eastern way of being, there is less analytical thought, and so that is emphasized in practice as a balance. Whereas here, I love the fact that we're having the compassion training is really spreading. We may need that more. We carry a big burden from the scientific revolution and the sort of more, I would say almost science is our religion in some sense. If stuff doesn't check out with that, it's not quite valid, right? So yeah, I mean, another side of my practice, which didn't come up today, is that I do something that's essentially like prayer. And I like to use the word faith also when I talk about the particular quality of saddha, which is sometimes translated as confidence or trust, which Westerners like better. But I say, let's call it faith. And there are ways of bringing in this sort of more devotional side. But we have to be a little careful in that the emotions can suck in just as much. I think we're looking for something that's neither rational thought nor emotion, truthfully. I see kind of mystical awareness as something that is left out of both of those and is maybe more toward what the Buddha was pointing at. And I'm unafraid to use that word. Yeah. But thank you. Okay, thanks everyone.